Welcome everyone to the webinar. We have, this is Faye Faraday speaking. We're expecting over 100 participants to be joining us today. We've got just over 55 at this point, but it is now 1 o'clock. It's a little bit after 1 o'clock. So I'd like to get us started. And for those of you who haven't been on this platform before, first of all, let's just do a very quick walk through what the different parts of it are. Karen Campbell, who is our colleague with the Canadian Women's Foundation, is going to be moderating the discussion on the webinar today. So Karen, do you want to just let people know about the different controls?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today. There are a few things that you can do during the course of this webinar. One thing is that if you have a question that you would like to pose, on the right-hand side of your panel, you should see a box that's called questions, and you can type in a question there. And we can either answer you privately if it's a tech concern, or we can answer to the whole group if we think it's relevant for everybody to see the answer to your question. The other thing that you can do is raise your hand if you want to make an intervention. So you should be able to see a little icon that has a hand shape on it. So you can raise your hand and that will flag for me that there's something that you'd like to say. And in addition to that, there's a chat box, and you can type into that chat box as well if you would like to communicate with the group. You'll also see on the right-hand side that there's a little tab called Handouts, and in there, there is a PDF, and I'll let Faye explain what that is, but you can open up the document that is there and see what resources available for you. There's also a green microphone button on the right-hand side, so you can mute and unmute yourself. And I think that pretty much sums up all of the different functions that we might be using.
That's fantastic. And what I'm trying to do here is share my screen with you, which I'll do in just a second. We'll have the presentation on here, but I want to make sure that we do this so that you're seeing, I can see my controls and you can see the screen. So here we go. There. So thanks. We'll start off, let me just start off briefly by giving you a look at what our agenda is for today. We will start off just with some general introductions. And there are a number of you who are joining us for the first time. So I'd like to set some of the context for who is this group that is together on the webinar today, and what is the context of the work that we're doing. We'll then get into our substantive discussion about women's economic justice, looking at it through the lens of the COVID-19 crisis. And then we want to open this up to more conversation and sharing of perspectives around what's working in the response to COVID, what urgent things do we need to advocate for right now, and what things are shifting that we need to make sure we hang on to in the post-COVID new normal. So just as an introduction to your organizers for today's webinar, my name's Faye Faraday. I'm the co-chair of the Equal Pay Coalition. And my co-host for today is Jan Borway. Jan, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. It's so exciting that you've been able to join the webinar today. We're looking very forward to this discussion.
And then, as I said, you've already met Karen Campbell. So, as I said, there are over 100 people who are going to be joining us, and folks are joining from over 50 different organizations right across the country, from coast to coast to coast, which is really fantastic. But rather than, that's far too many people for us to be able to read out a list of who's here, and even far too many to identify organizations. So we'd like to do a little interactive poll, and I'd like to launch the first question just so we can get a sense of who's part of this conversation today. So you should see on your screen the first poll about who's joining the conversation. So can you tell us where you're from geographically? And my apologies for grouping different regions together. We can only put 5 different options on the poll. So let us know where you're from.
And just so we don't skew the results, Faye, neither you nor I can vote.
That's right.
And Faye, I understand Karen's monitoring the results for us.
Okay, we've got most people have responded.
Okay, I'm going to close the poll.
Okay.
And here are your results.
So we've got a number of people from Ontario, from Quebec, and smaller numbers from BC, the Prairies, and the Maritimes, but there is still cross-country distribution here, which is great. So let's have a look at our next poll. So we want to look at what kind of organization you're with. As I said, we have people from a range of different organizations and different kinds of work. So let us know where you come from and your perspective in coming into this conversation.
Almost everybody, 92% of you have voted. Just give a couple more seconds. All right, so I'm going to close the poll, and here are the results.
So we've got 53% of you are joining us from community organizations. A third of you are joining us from trade unions, 17% from other social movements, and 2% are not affiliated with an organization. So thank you for bringing, oh, and we've got 2% from Indigenous communities. So thank you so much for bringing all that richness of experience to this discussion. And one more question before we move on. We are focusing on women's economic justice. And so we want to get a sense of what part of the economy you're joining us from. Like, where are the people who you advocate for? Where are they located? And you can choose more than one response here. Click as many of the responses as make sense for the work that you're doing.
All right, almost everyone has voted. So I'm going to close this one, and here are your results.
So you'll see that the figures here add up to more than 100%, and that's because many of you are working in more than one area. The folks that you're working with are spread across the labor market, but there is really strong representation right across the economy, and I particularly want to welcome our friends from the arts and culture sector who so often are missing from these discussions. It's fantastic to have you here. Okay, so why don't we return to move on with our conversation. So what I want to do is give you a bit of an introduction to the context, where it is that we're coming from in this work. This work is part of a cross-movement building summit that is gathering later this fall. We had planned to be gathering, in fact, today. Today was supposed to be the first day of our Cross Canada Summit. But obviously it has been postponed, which has just given us the opportunity to build deeper connections through these webinars. The thinking behind the summit was to bring together people across the labor movement and from the community sector across multiple different social justice movements, to combine our efforts and our knowledge and perspectives to strategize around how to address the really deep structural and systemic drivers of women's economic insecurity. And beyond mapping what's there, we actually are intending to identify plans of action and to plan an alternate vision that really does leave no one behind. So this is very much a community building, community mobilizing effort. When we've been looking at women's economic inequality, we've been looking at all the various levels at which that resonates. So this slide, some of you have seen before, looks at a number of the drivers of women's economic insecurity when you're looking at it at the job level. The fact that there's unequal pay, there's barriers to getting hired and trained, that women predominate in precarious jobs, they don't get as many hours of work, they have unequal care duties, they face gender-based violence, both outside of the workplace and in the workplace. They face heightened barriers to unionizing, and they are clustered in female gendered jobs that are undervalued and underpaid. But all of that inequality in the labor market is operating on a much deeper structure of inequality. We have the decades-long cult of austerity, which has been cutting away at the notions of the common good for a long time, and we're seeing the fruits of that in this moment. There's the cult of flexibility for employers, but not for workers. We've had decades of attacks on union rights, a persistent undervaluing of care work. What we're seeing right now in particular with COVID is a heightened racism. That's certainly been given much more license in the last few years, and it's being accelerated in the racist attacks in the face of COVID, and all of this is operating on deep structures of colonialism that are continuing to be deeply damaging to Indigenous communities and to our common good. So when we look at the work that we're doing, we recognize that there's a lot of systemic drivers and that of women's economic inequality, and that small tweaks are not going to do it. When we look at how the summit is, the arc of the summit, it's interesting because this situation with COVID is giving us a microcosm of the conversation that we were planning to have at the summit and that we will do. We're beginning our conversations by doing some blue sky dreaming. What is the world that we want to live in? Instead of being constrained by ideas of what's marginally possible, we want to think big about what is actually the world that we want to live in. And our conversation was going to be following exactly this arc, that there are alternatives, and that when we look at those alternatives, we see the really deep connections between a number of different movements. From that blue sky dreaming, we are looking at plans, building plans for action, and that focuses on the importance of the common good and the notion of the role of public services as integral to promoting the common good. It looks at what real nation-to-nation relationships in a decolonized way look like. And then we will be drilling down into different themes that affect women's economic insecurity more precisely. And from there, we'll be moving into mobilizing and thinking about what is it that we can do better together than on our own, and what kinds of commitments to action are we willing to take on. But when we look at the situation of COVID itself, that has shown us very starkly that there are alternatives and that we can shift quite radically in response to a crisis that highlights what our common good is, and that we can plan for action and mobilize together. So the work that we'll be doing between now and the fall, when the summit convenes in person, we'll be building on that arc. And I think that this gives us a great opportunity to build that work and that discussion in this very concrete context. In terms of the summit dates, we're still looking for dates. And we hope that we'll be able to announce that in a couple of weeks. So, before we move into the next section around looking at the gendered impacts of the COVID crisis, I just want to ask you one more poll, or actually two more polls. The first question is, who are you advocating for? When you think about women's economic insecurity, who are the folks who you work with with your organization and in your advocacy work? And again, pick as many categories as makes sense for you.
Just giving a couple more seconds here for folks to vote. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and show the results. There you go.
So once again, you can see that the numbers add up to significantly more than 100 because you are working across many different streams. And as you see, all of the different areas of economic security or insecurity are represented here. Okay, and I'd like to ask the last question, which is a simple yes, no, maybe. In the area of your work, is a gender-based analysis being used to look at the impacts of COVID?
Okay, just a couple more seconds. All right, and here are the results.
So just under half say that a gender analysis is being brought to the work, and just over half say no or only occasionally. And I think that that's an important reality check for us, because as we move into the next section of our work, we want to put some real numbers on what the gendered impacts of the COVID crisis are. We are going to take you through some stats, and I'm going to hand the presentation over to Jan Borway at this point for the next portion.
Great, thanks very much, Faye. Now, without a doubt, the COVID pandemic is revealing a very clear understanding of the women's true role in the economy. You know, we see women on the front lines. We also see that women are bearing the brunt of much of what is going on with the pandemic. So as Faye had said at the top of our session, we know that women did not start from a place of full equality and a place from which their work was fully valued relative to men. So we thought, let's start by really understanding who's on the front lines. Women are dominating the high-risk jobs in this pandemic. They're absolutely on the front lines, without a doubt, throughout healthcare. We see jobs that are dominated by women, whether they're nurses, RPNs, etc. 92% of women are nurses. Medical laboratory technicians are 80% women. Respiratory therapists, very high number. Personal support workers are women. Many of these women, of course, come from a variety of communities, and particularly racialized and immigrant communities. In childcare, we see an incredible female-dominated profession. There it's 99% women. Similarly, in community and social services, very, very female-dominated. Cashiers, those working in food prep and service, and cleaners as well. These are the women who head out the door every single day to assist in a variety of ways with ensuring that we have a response that knits our society together in response to this horrific pandemic. I do want to point out that what we've, in pulling together these stats, Faye and I've relied on the terrific work of the folks over at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which includes Catherine Scott's most recent piece looking at the gender crisis, the gender fault lines of the pandemic. We've relied extensively on much of the work by Sheila Block and Grace Edward Calabuzo, which looked at the color-coded income inequality in the labor market, and as well as much of the work done at Stats Canada. So Faye, why don't we go to the next slide? So you may question, well, how is it that these women are on the front lines? Well, our labor market is one that is skewed in a particular way. Women dominate the 5 C's within our Canadian labor market. We have the Canadian labor market in this regard sees a profound occupational, what gets called occupational segregation, where women are employed predominantly in care work. They're employed in clerical work, catering, cashiering, and cleaning, what get called the 5 C's. In addition to this, we're finding what we're calling the double, traditionally women have the double burden where you work and then return home to carry out other childcare duties. But under COVID, now you have in-home care with workers laid off having to try to juggle both their family responsibilities and their work responsibilities at the same time. So we've got women then who are also in care work occupations who are heading out the door to care for people in the community, only to turn around and have to continue that care work when they return home. So it's very important to understand the way in which women's work has been undervalued is directly connected with the work women are doing. The fact that it is care work and not viewed as having the same value in the historic economy. And of course, what we're posing the question on as we walk through our discussion today is there is an alternative, and is there an alternative to really value this kind of work that women are doing? So Faye,
and before we move on to the next slide, I just want to draw attention to the really important class and racialized dynamics of this when we look at the shift from the double burden to the triple burden, because it is the most vulnerable women who had been providing in-home care in the way of child care work supporting elders, and people with disabilities who in many situations have been laid off because their employers can no longer afford to pay for them or to practice social distancing in the home. And so those more vulnerable workers, many of whom are migrant workers, are facing even greater insecurity.
Okay, so
for the next slide, I just have one quick question that came in the question box. When you list cleaners, are you talking about like office cleaners, house cleaners? What kind of cleaning are you talking about?
That's a really good question. At this point, Stats Canada doesn't seem to differentiate in their statistical gathering between cleaning, whether it's public sector cleaning or private sector cleaning. That's very, Pat Armstrong's done a fair amount of work on this as a longtime sociologist at York University to try and track the different ways in which cleaning is understood to be captured by Stats Canada. So it's generally speaking, this has been looking at just the generic category right now. So we haven't been able to distill down into that level of, is it domestic cleaners, those who, for instance, may work for a subcontractor, but actually work in a hospital. And that gets us into the problems with Stats Canada. It's a good question, which actually does raise an important point, which I know when you out of the United Nations, there's been a huge push amongst UN women to say we have to start really tracking women's work in a finer detail. And this is a very good example of the fact that stats don't help us very much here. So in our next slide, what we wanted to do was just review with you again the data on the undervaluing of women's work. As Faye said, we're not in a labor market, we're not an economy that treats women equally. And so what we know is that on average, women across Canada face an approximate 32% pay gap. But that, of course, doesn't tell us the complete story. Averages never do. And so what we need to do is look at the multiple layers of discrimination and how that accumulates and combines to create an impact that really creates a deeper level of discrimination. So one way we've done this is to say, so let's look at the gender pay gap through a variety of lenses. So women with disabilities have the greatest pay gap at 56%. Immigrant women, 55%, Indigenous women, 45%, and racialized women at 40%. So it's really by driving into a deeper analysis that we actually see the distinct forms of discrimination in the labor market. And again, if folks are looking for a really good source of data, I really encourage you to look at Sheila Block and Grace Edward Calabuzzo's study from December 2019, which looked at Canada's color-coded income inequality. It's a really good report. So Faye, shall we scoot to the next slide, which is, so while we've looked at women on the front lines who are doing the work, that of course isn't the entire story of COVID. As our economy has been shutting down in certain areas, it's been women who are also in particular industries that are hardest hit by COVID. So we have airlines, number one example most recently, arts, culture, recreation, and sports, as things have shut down, women working in retail, accommodation, and food services. So those are just some of the industries that have been particularly hard hit by COVID. And David McDonald's study out of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which was released just in March, does a terrific tracking of this. Next, so let's look at what that actually then means for women who, in the midst of COVID. First, unemployment and layoffs due to COVID will hit women harder. It will hit those who are part-time workers harder at 25%. And I think it's important to understand that what we anticipate, while there's an overall increase in unemployment going to hit the Canadian labor market, it's women that'll feel that the greatest, for instance, those who are working in retail, those where there's also a high proportion of part-time workers. But when you then look at the income of those workers in those sectors, 42% of workers making $14 an hour or less, and 32% of workers making between $14 and $16 an hour are at an immediate risk of layoff. And so since the beginning of March, we've seen stories emerge where those who are at the risk of layoff, in fact, are the lowest income. And it's very important to keep this in mind, that this is showing us one of the significant negative impacts, the significant divide in our labor market. So when we think about this with respect to a gender lens, it's women, particularly racialized women, immigrant women, women with disabilities, who make up 70% of those precariously employed workers. It's women who are 70% part-time workers. They're on short-term contracts, they either or temp agencies, and are in casual work. So again, based on their job status, these women will face a significant negative impact. And as we move just quickly to the next slide, I'll turn it over to Faye, because as we want to work through the various elements of the impact, while we've looked at the impact around income and access to jobs, that doesn't tell us the complete story. So Faye, why don't I turn it over to you now?
Actually, Jan, can I just interject first?
Sure.
A question posed is, are trans women included in these stats? And generally, to what extent are gender non-conforming, non-binary, and other folks represented in any of our stats?
I'm happy to respond to that. This is, again, an area where there has been a really significant lack of data. There have been statistics that have been collected. There's a number of excellent reports through Pulse that have looked at stats in the trans and gender nonconforming community, but there are not a detail and either a depth or breadth of stats to be able to show them on the national scale as we've been doing with these other stats. What we know absolutely for sure is that discrimination in the workplace that we see is deeply gendered. And even though our communities are not binary, that there is a wide range of genders and gendered expressions, the way that coercive gender norms apply in the workplace really drives down on a binary. So it is the way that those dynamics of gender discrimination operate penalize people, the women and gender nonconforming people, by imposing differential value based on conformity with an ordering of the economy based on a gender binary, in which anything that is not male is devalued. But that is an area where the stats are really only starting to be collected, and it's an area where definitely a lot more empirical evidence and analysis is needed. But so I will speak about gender-based violence as well, because this is one of the really immediate heightened risks that we see right across our communities. It is a pattern in violent relationships that conditions of uncertainty, unemployment, financial stress, fear, any dynamics where there's a sense of loss of control, that intensifies the circumstances that lead to spikes in violence. So anytime there has been broad social disruption, either through recessions, layoffs, environmental disasters, and so on, there immediately follows a spike in gendered violence. When we combine that social stress and economic stress with practices of self-isolation and physical distancing, that intensifies the risks and the impacts of gender-based violence, where women are trapped in isolation with their abusers. That proximity, that inability to leave, the lack of access to supports and networks, lack of access to information, all of that heightens the intensity of abuse. And when you combine that for folks who have precarious migration status, it becomes even more dangerous. What we've seen, and these are stats that The Guardian in the UK compiled in Hubei in the weeks after the rise of COVID. The reports of intimate partner violence tripled. In Brazil, within a matter of weeks, the increase was 40 to 50%, the same in Italy with 30%. In Spain, in the first few days of their clampdown on COVID, there was a 20% increase in reports of violence. So this is a very serious issue, and Canada has not yet responded with the kind of measures that would address that very real risk. As well, Indigenous communities face very particular risks that are driven by the colonial structures that have already created so much harm. As we've been saying throughout, we are not all starting from the same platform of security. And we know that the impacts of colonialism have left Indigenous communities with a widespread lack of clean water, overcrowded and inadequate housing, a lack of access to medical services and supplies, especially in the north, a lack of access to food. And we know that systemic racism has resulted in over 40% of the women who are incarcerated being Indigenous. And this is nothing new. We've seen this before. And it's important to note that during the H1N1 outbreak, Indigenous people suffered significantly disproportionately. Indigenous people make up about 4% of the population, but they accounted for nearly 20% of hospital admissions, 63% of whom were First Nations, 26% of critically ill patients, and 18% of deaths. Dr. Pamela Palmater has put together a number of important pieces highlighting the impact of COVID on Indigenous communities. I recommend them to you strongly. And a lot of this is also presaged in the report from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
Faye, could I just add just briefly, Pam Palmateer has also done a piece, I think it was just released yesterday or 2 days ago, in Canadian Dimension, looking at the gendered impact of COVID. So it's a highly recommended read, and it's available online.
And in addition to all this, there are the circumstances that are facing migrant workers. And I won't go into depth on that because I know that Jill Hanley will be speaking soon, so I will leave that for her. But I just want to take a pause here, and everyone please take a nice big deep breath. That is, like, we've just given you a series of slides of doom and gloom. And so this is just so that we can take a little moment. It's so important for us to have these stats, to have the empirical data in order to strengthen our advocacy, particularly when people have a high level of disbelief or denial about the way that discrimination operates in our communities. But at the same time, we recognize that reality, but let's not be overwhelmed by it. We had, there are, as I said, almost 100 people on the phone, and so, or the webinars, so it's not possible to have a free-form discussion, but I have invited a couple of people to make some comments. Tamsin from the Women of the Métis Nation, are you on there? Let's just have a look at our attendees.
I am here.
Okay, fantastic. Would you like to bring us your perspective?
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Tamsin, and I'm with Leifam Michif Otapemsowak. I hope everyone's doing well and keeping safe, and thank you so much to Faye for the invitation to LFMO to speak about COVID-19 as it impacts Métis women. So I'll just touch briefly on the impacts that we've been seeing in our communities. And so Métis kids, especially in school, who are trying to do online schooling, are struggling, especially because they don't have the proper technology to do that. In Alberta specifically, actually, kids are required to get a Chromebook for their online schooling software, which obviously isn't a possibility for all families. And so we're worried about the kids being left behind. And of course, they're told that they'll pass on, but there's still a great deal of the curriculum that they're missing out on. We're also seeing a lot of panic and fear just because our communities are being advised to, you know, wipe down things with Lysol wipes and use hand sanitizer, but this isn't really available in their communities. And we've actually seen a lot of violence too. There was a murder of a family in Prince Albert 2 days ago. And so when we're talking about violence, often the government is really focusing in on shelters as opposed to intimate partner violence. So that's some of the impacts that we've been seeing. And what LFMO has been advocating for has been a gendered, intersectional, and distinctions-based lens in any response to COVID-19 funding. And we go into greater detail in our press release, which is on our website and our social media. So I encourage you to take a look for more details in Métis Women's realities there. And responses that are working. Dr. Carrie Barassa, in partnership with the Morningstar Lodge, created a COVID-19 strategy for Indigenous communities. It's called Protecting Our Home Fires. It's an information campaign, and it's built around the home fire, which is a cultural and traditional practice and a central piece in many Métis communities. And so it's a culture-based information campaign, and it's been doing really well. I encourage you all to take a look at that, again, called Protecting Our Home Fires. And we've also been collaborating with Dr. Janet Smiley, who's been leading a project that's focused on COVID-19 data tracking in Indigenous communities. And one of the priorities there is using First Nation, Inuit, and Métis governance as overseeing their own respective data. And we've also got a page on our website too, which I encourage you to look at as well. And what needs to be built into the new normal kind of moving forward is Métis women and representatives of the Métis Nation need to be, you know, guiding voices so that Métis women, girls, and gender diverse people's realities are considered in any federal response to COVID-19.
That's really wonderful. Thank you so much, Tamsin. And what we will be doing is putting together a website for the Rising Together Summit. We'll post materials from our webinars, and we'd be happy to post links to other information that people have available. So if your organization has other materials that you'd like to share with us, we'd be happy to make that available. So next, I'd like to invite Jill Hanley from the Immigrant Workers Center in Montreal.
Hi there, everybody. Thanks for this opportunity to share what's going on here. I'm sure a lot of what's happening here is very much like what's happening in other parts of the country, but the Immigrant Workers Center works particularly with precarious workers and precarious status workers. So I thought I would share some of the concerns among undocumented women and migrant worker women. So just to start, like immediately when the shutdown started happening around March 15th in Quebec, it came, you know, a little bit quicker here than in some other provinces, I think. We were hearing from undocumented women immediately. They were the first ones laid off in most workplaces if they were in a general workplace. Also, many of them relied on informal work, doing in-home childcare or cleaning in multiple homes, and their employers were no longer comfortable having them come into the homes once this crisis was declared. So they very quickly lost their jobs, and still to this day, there's no real avenue for them to have income replacement. Even for those who didn't lose their jobs, their children, if they had children, were out of school and having to stay at home with them. And again, there's no income replacement. So this is something the IWC is trying to advocate around. It seems with the Migrant Workers Alliance at the federal level, there may be potentially something, but we don't have a lot of hope. This has never been a group that the government's been willing to give something like income security to, so we're very concerned. There seems to be some opportunity in Quebec where the provincial benefit is actually being managed by the Red Cross, and we've had some conversations with the Red Cross, and they may be willing to look at the situation of undocumented people, specifically sort of parallel to the government benefit. So in other provinces, if you're looking at potential advocacy around this, we'd love it to be the government, but if not, maybe there is an opening with big NGOs like the Red Cross. Those women are really concerned because if this goes on, well, we know now it's going to go on for a long time. They really don't know how they're going to make ends meet. When it comes to migrant workers, in Quebec, the biggest group of low income migrant workers are in the agriculture sector, probably like a lot of provinces, and women make up a very small number of the agricultural workers in Quebec, like less than 5%, I think. But they share the conditions of other migrant workers, that they often have shared living quarters that are very crowded, that have, you know, health and safety implications at the best of time. But when you're supposed to be doing physical distancing and potentially social isolation, quarantine when they first arrive, it's still not worked out how that can be ensured given the type of housing they usually have. There's a lot of concerns about their health. We do seem to be able to get benefits for migrant workers that have been laid off. So that is going pretty well so far. And they have, the province has extended free treatment related to COVID to anyone who's health insurance, who's uninsured or who has spotty health insurance. On the flip side, from a gendered angle, we have always had the problem that when migrant workers who are women lose their jobs and lose their housing, we have better luck with the women's shelters finding spots for them to stay. But right now we're meeting many migrant workers losing their jobs, and there isn't really a shelter system outside the homeless shelter system to support them. So there's really not a lot of options for them to go. Well, this is something, it's an ongoing issue in Quebec. So the IWC is organizing around this. We're having a press conference on Monday morning, actually, about the health and safety conditions of people who continue to work in the support services like cleaners, warehouse workers, grocery workers, and about how they're being exposed to COVID risks with much less attention to their health and safety in those circumstances. So we're in the thick of it. A lot of casework right now. So I'll share that for now.
Thank you so much, Jill. What I'll also note is that the Migrant Rights Network has been advocating strongly as well for migrant workers through this crisis, and they have an important petition on their website at migrantrights.ca. So again, people have been asking about, can we have links to various things? I can certainly send a follow-up email with some of the links, and as I said, we are putting together a website that that will at some point later this month have a number of resources on it. So please feel free to send us stuff and share information with us. So this is the point where of our webinar where we want to open this up for discussion. The webinar is scheduled to run until 2:30, so we've got about half an hour for discussion. And I should have said this right off the top. With sincere apologies to our Francophone colleagues on the webinar. We only have one audio track available, and so we can't do simultaneous interpretation. We are looking into whether we can get typewritten transcribed interpretation in the future, but at this point we can't do live verbal interpretation, but please feel free to speak in the language that is most comfortable for you. So Jan, I'll hand this over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Faye. So through this pandemic and this crisis, we've noticed that the government is reacting. So after many, well, 30 plus years of austerity where the government says, no, there can't be a role for regulation, there can't be a role for government funding, the government has to retreat and retreat and retreat, we see something different. We see something new that seems to be emerging. Suddenly there's income support. Suddenly there's shifts in the way in which the government is talking. And it's moving at such a rapid rate. I don't know how others feel about this, but there's literally an announcement a day on some shift with respect to a government response. So what we were hoping we could do in the next number of minutes was actually open up and have a discussion of what's working from the COVID response. What is making a difference? Part of that will have to do with your own advocacy and your different organizations, which we think it's really important to share. But what from your vantage point with the communities and the groups you work with, do you see something that's working? Because this, it seems, starts to lay the basis for the future. So what we were hoping you could do is in the chat box section, you can open that up so that you can send a message to everyone. And with Karen's assistance, we'll be collating these and asking other further questions. And if you'd like to make a comment, then you can actually raise your hand. And that is also one of the little icons over in the right-hand section of your screen. You can raise your hand and Karen can identify you and I believe open up a mic. So what from the COVID response is working? What do people have to say? Is the emergency relief benefit going to work? Is that creating more problems? Because it obviously has not been harmonized with EI. In other words, EI hasn't been brought up to the new level under the emergency relief benefit for workers. That emergency relief benefit covers some folks, but not others. What do people think? That's one example of an income support that years ago, or certainly in the last number of years, the government has said, no, they can't make changes to the EI system.
There is a comment here from Sultana, and I was just going to see, it looks like she may have had to leave the webinar, unfortunately, but she did make her comment before she left, and it's in relation to the emergency benefit. So her concern is that, and sort of echoing what Jill was talking about, racialized immigrant women who are overrepresented in the 5C jobs that you described, she's concerned that they'll be excluded from the emergency benefit and from EI generally because of the ways that employers tactically issue their, what she's calling cause of leaving. So she's suggesting that that they are somehow made to be ineligible, even if they should otherwise be. And so she's trying to indicate that employers need to be held to account in the denial of benefits to this group of women.
Have others run into this situation where an employer is not defining it as a COVID layoff, or someone is not being fully recognized as having to remain at home due to COVID? We encourage you to add your comments.
I'm seeing that Natalie has her hand raised, so I'm just going to unmute her mic so that she can speak. Go ahead, Natalie.
Yes, hi. What we are seeing, and we see that as an opportunity to act, is with the minimum salary. We've realized that for some people who work the minimum wage, well, they would be better off in some circumstances just if they could leaving their job and getting the PCU, because they're getting slightly more. The provincial government has reacted to that by proposing to balance it off. We're not quite sure how that's going to work yet because there's so many things being announced, and every day, as you were saying, Jan, there's a new announcement from the federal government and from the provincial government every day, so it's hard to follow. But it's giving us one more opportunity to promote minimum wage at $15 as we have been doing. So I think it also brings to the forefront the fact that this work, which people are doing usually at the minimum rate, is essential in the economy and it should be paid more. So I think it's an opportunity that we have there.
And it looks like Lisa Kelly is saying that they've also had that issue where incorrect ROEs have been issued. And she's given a link with an example as well from Unifor that I'm not actually sure if everyone can see, but we'll make sure that people can look at that as well.
Okay. And maybe if Lisa's available to jump on the call, you could just describe what was in the link, Lisa.
Unmuting Lisa. Go ahead, Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So we had this issue at one of our casinos where the record of employment did not reflect shortage of work, and Service Canada was very clear that people who were being let go because of a drop in business that was related to COVID needed to be marked shortage of work. So we were able to get that corrected, but while people did have that on their EI forms, and this was before the emergency benefits were announced, it meant a excessive delay for them, for those workers. So it's something where we did put together, a piece that's in that link about employers sabotaging the workers' access to, at that point, the EI benefits because of that. And then I don't, because that one got resolved, I don't know what happened in terms of them rolling on to emergency benefits. But I think the other thing, and I might be misunderstanding Sultana, I think the other thing she's bringing into play potentially is the identity of the true employer. And this has always been, and whether or not you are an independent contractor, whether or not you're supposedly self-employed, lots of these ruses that are used not to, pay and protect workers particularly impact women, particularly impact workers of color and new immigrants. Like it really, if you look at those folks and the mischaracterization of their employment relationship, it's got a gendered and race element to it. So looking at some of these benefits that are brought out that seem really great and progressive on paper, and then sifting down, as you've done, as David McDonald has done, to say who gets it and who's missing from that. Sultana's on the money, where many of the folks that she works with from the South Asian community will be left out of those benefits.
Right. So what that's doing then is also identifying for us gaps that are existing in these responses that we need to absolutely keep lobbying and try to change as we're going forward, even in the short term. Are there other questions or comments people might have? Because otherwise, Faye, we might turn it over to the next question.
There was a comment actually from Pat Armstrong. I'm going to turn Pat's mic on just for a second. Pat, go ahead. Can you hear us, Pat? Okay, she had an example from BC that I've actually honestly accidentally deleted. So I'm going to have to find it for us later and share it out. So my apologies to Pat. Go ahead, Jen.
Okay. Well, I think there's many ways in which we've identified, and Lisa's example there with Sultana's was very important, on these multiple layers of discrimination are not being fully addressed in the responses by the government, and which means then that it's also going to be women, racialized women, and others are really going to have the greatest difficulty recovering from this crisis. So, you know, we can, as on one hand, the short-term response looks great, but when you actually drill down and dive into it, we can see there needs to be more that needs to be done. And so, Faye, why don't I turn it over to you of what needs to be added?
Thanks, Jen. So there were a few things that were introduced very quickly when COVID came down, things like not requiring a doctor's note for an absence. But we've had a limited number of things identified that are working to address all the gaps. So the big question is, what do we need now? When we think about what are the things that we can do better together, obviously there is a lot of advocacy that needs to happen, both in the immediate and short term and in the longer term. So this question is focused on what urgently needs to be added right now during this period of crisis response for the women that you're working with. And again, please raise your hand or add a message in the chat box, and Karen will throw the mic to you.
So there is a comment in this vein from a little bit earlier from Morna Ballantyne about childcare, just that the programs, many of them have been shuttered, and that this is likely to be a permanent situation without government intervention. So big issues in the childcare sector that she's referencing.
So one question I would have back for Morna is, do we see this as an opportunity now in the midst of the COVID pandemic to say to the government, where the heck is your national public childcare program? So that, as it's very interesting because I've forgotten which day it was, but with the government coming in to say that it will provide funding for certain employers, particularly small and medium-sized employers, to help them get through this crisis. The question is, will childcare centers be covered through this? And if so, then why doesn't that just lay the basis for a national childcare program?
Morna does have a comment on that. So Morna, I'm going to unmute your microphone for you so that you can tell us directly. Or I'm going to try to anyways. There you go. Go ahead.
I think I just did it. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for organizing this webinar. It's great. Yeah, so we're sort of trying to respond to this pandemic and what it's done to the childcare sector in a whole number of different ways. We have to respond locally, provincially, territorially, and federally. But I think what we've been trying to do is use what's happening around the care sector and childcare specifically to make the point over and over again to government that a sector like the childcare sector is fragile and precarious, and the workers, most of whom, as you've already pointed out, are women, are in an incredibly precarious position because governments have just left childcare to the marketplace, and that it's the systems that are actually fully publicly funded and publicly managed, the public service systems that are publicly funded and publicly managed, that are sustaining themselves, are able to continue to deliver service better than those that aren't. So we've been making that point, and we're also pushing really hard for government intervention, and we're doing it in such a way as to hopefully put in place funding that is going to be very difficult to remove once the pandemic is over. It's interesting, for example, that we pushed hard for the opening of emergency childcare for parents who were performing critical functions in the pandemic, and by that we defined critical very broadly, unlike governments. And a number of those services are being provided free, fully funded by government. So that sets a good precedent that we intend to try to keep in place as we go into recovery. And also we're making the point that childcare has shown itself to be critical through this pandemic. Of course, it's always critical, and it's going to be critical to economic recovery. So that's going to be our main argument for more sustained government support.
Great.
That's great. Thanks, Morna. You know, I want to acknowledge that this is not a conversation that we are going to finish in one webinar. This is obviously the conversation that we are all engaged in and that we're all trying to grapple with in real time as things are changing daily. So we will continue to come back to this conversation, but it's helpful to get, you know, some perspectives on the table that we don't hear much about, and just get some thoughts out there. You know, I noticed at the beginning that there were a number of people from the arts and culture sector. A lot of the kind of programs that are being put in place aren't really designed around project-based work. Does anybody from the arts and culture sector have any comments about what needs to be added now?
I'm not seeing anybody in the chat box right now, but I do see that Andrea Babington has her hand raised. I don't know if she's from that sector, but I'll unmute you, Andrea.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm actually from the hotel the hospitality sector, and I think one concern that we have, including all the different areas that I think the speakers touch on, at this point we're hearing a little bit. So we have about 90% of our members that are already laid off into the hotel sector, hotel and food service sector. And at the same time, we're hearing a little bit of conversation about the city wanting to use some of these hotels to put in for a shelter base or maybe refugees. But at the same, and then there's a second part of it where there are needs for some of these hotels for quarantine. So we have been reaching out to the city, and then we're now looking at whether this is where the federal level need to step in terms of health and safety. So we have a large group or a large percent of women that clean into these hotels. And it's possible that at some point they have to return. Some of them will return to some of these jobs, but at the same time, we're hearing from some employers that it's the government that is in full control of the hotels that they need to use for quarantine, not the owners of these hotels. What we're having challenges with at this point is having the federal government coming in to make sure that, yes, it's used for quarantine, but the health and safety aspect of it, whether it's the gears that people need to wear and all the procedure need to be a priority, it's almost as a tool for these people working with. So we're not getting anywhere with that at this point, and I'm really concerned because we have women who are saying to us, look, I'd rather go to work knowing that I am safe. I know I have the proper protection and I'm not exposing myself or my children versus going for a lower, going through the EI process. So that's a little bit of the challenge that we're having at this point for a lot of the women that are saying, I'd rather go or I'm too afraid in this sense to trust what's happening.
Thanks very much, Andrea. That's a really important perspective to bring to it, because you're right that when government is repurposing different facilities to a COVID response, that question of who is accountable, who is the employer, becomes much more complicated. Do other people have any comments, other comments about what they're seeing that needs to be added now?
So I see Lisa Kelly has her hand raised. Lisa, you're self-muted, so if you'd like to speak, you can unmute yourself.
Great, thanks. So just as we were hearing around childcare and Morna, outlining that, the cracks in the system that are being revealed, I think one of the things that's being revealed about long-term care is equally that idea, that people who don't have parents in long-term care or family members in long-term care sometimes feel like it's a public system, and they don't understand that it is really got a large section of private for-profit employers or owners. And you've got a raft of part-time workers there. And I think that's a sector that is a perfect example of this lie that women work part-time because they want to, because they've got other things that they're working around, or that they need some pin money, or whatever the old idea was. So we've got so many members that work 2 part-time jobs, 3 part-time jobs, and 3 different care facilities. So now that we're seeing in the pandemic the real toll that it's taking in the long-term care, I think more people's eyes are open to some of the problems with standards, some of the problems around lack of adequate care. There's not mandatory care hours that are adequate, and similar to childcare, as people's eyes are turned to that, I think that there's a real opportunity to have those sectors much better managed, much better funded and resourced. And just, one last really quick point that I want to make is that the initial supports that were coming from the government really were through that market lens. And it was only as of late that some of the income supports or other supports of employers included nonprofit sectors and charity sectors. It's still not clear whether or not unions are going to fall under that, but a full third of our membership has been laid off, and that's even with people getting supports from the government to try and get them through this isolation period, and we're expecting it to be greater. So all of those statistics that you just put up there around airlines, around all of these sectors that have really been decimated, hotels, things like that, means that no dues are coming in. And so we're facing a really large layoff within the union, and we're not looking at getting back up to full strength for quite a long time. And that's going to affect unions right across the board, that play really critical roles in advocating around social justice and around sometimes funding those organizations that are also able to work around social justice. So I think that cascading fallout is, again, not within the sightlines of the government, who's trying to shore up employers and help employees from hitting rock bottom. And as you said off the top, missing a lot of the employees, not equally supporting people, so that gender and race are going to compound, the vulnerability. But organizations themselves, I think that there's a real lack of understanding what this is going to mean. Over and out.
Thanks, Lisa. That's a tremendously important reflection as we think about what are the long-term impacts and the impacts that will echo into the future. It becomes even more urgent in those circumstances that we work together across movements, so that we can be amplifying our messages and strengthening each other and holding each other up when we are we have very limited resources ourselves. It is one of the things where that lets us be stronger together than on our own.
And Faye, to that point, how is it best, and this is an open question to everyone, what's the best way for us to keep exchanging demands and stay in touch that way? Is that through, folks can email the summit, they can email each other. It's a way to keep building. I've just learned an awful lot from Andrea's comments out of HRE Local 75 of the impact for women who are cleaners in hotels who don't have access to the proper masks and personal protective equipment. So, there's so many layers to what is happening with respect to this crisis. But I think the more we can exchange, the better. So do people have ideas on how they'd like that to happen? I don't know, Karen, if we're getting any ideas.
Well, I see that Pat Armstrong has a hand raised, so I'm going to unmute Pat. Pat, go ahead. I think we had a challenge calling on Pat before as well. So Pat, if you are having trouble with your mic, maybe you can type it into the chat box for us. Sorry for that. So just looking to see who else. I'm going to call on Jane Stinson next. She's got a suggestion in here. Go ahead, Jane.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think more discussions like this are really helpful. Because we do have the opportunity to hear each other, engage in a different way, and maybe come up with some great ideas, be able to collaborate and strategize more. And I think your offer to create space on the website is another way we might be able to sort of share ideas, resources, examples. For example, I just wanted to raise earlier that there's an, I think, interesting example coming out of BC through the role of the provincial health officers now having the power to establish, what do they call it, a single site requirement for staff. We know that through privatization, there's and contracting out, there's been a move to precarious employment, part-time jobs, and for women to make a living, they have to work in more than one facility, and this is transmitting the COVID virus. So it's interesting, the powers of the medical health officers, and I think this is sort of an interesting way back to try to create full-time jobs with good, decent salaries. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
That's a really important point on a single site of employment, Jane, because of course, back in the SARS crisis, here in Toronto in particular, where it spread in ways that did not happen in BC, the commission and the public inquiry that looked into SARS under Justice Campbell concluded that it was because so many healthcare workers were precariously employed in part-time that led to the spread of SARS. Now here we are again, almost 20 years later with COVID-19, and that precarity in the healthcare employment relationships has just really exploded between casual and part-times, as Lisa's pointed out, and it creates risk. And if we've got a BC public officer of health willing to step in, so should the Prime Minister and the other provincial public health officers. That's a really good point.
There is a suggestion in the text box from Barb Byers as well about information dissemination on this. So Barb, I've unmuted you. You can go ahead.
Oh, hi. I was just thinking that two things. One of them was about the BC situation. I think that Jane's hit it, all the points there, is that it will bring people into not only having full-time work at one facility, but it will raise their wages up, which is really important. But in terms of the information, some of the information that we've got today, I'm wondering if there's people at home, or maybe we can call on some of our union sisters who may have some comms people who are working from home that could take some of that information and turn it into daily fast facts about the effects of COVID on women and other equity groups within women as well. And then that's something that could be sent out, on a much broader way. So it could, you get it to us, and then it's our responsibility to get it to, to our various social media means.
Fantastic. On that point, what I would say, actually, I'm keeping an eye on time. If you go to the handout section on your control panel, you can download these slides from that part of the screen. There were some folks who were asking, can we get links to various of the stats and reports that are cited? We've hyperlinked all the reports that we've cited, so you should be able to reach those from those documents. But certainly, disseminating this information is very important. So thank you, Barb, for that. I am keeping an eye on time. We've got about a minute left, and thank you to people for staying for this long, substantive webinar. We had promised in our earlier webinars that we will continue to host webinars like this from now until our summit in the fall. And at the end of the webinar, when you sign out, you will receive a 3-question survey to answer. And we're really soliciting your feedback on what are the topics that you want to be talking about on these webinars. We can absolutely come back to talk again in more detail about the gendered impacts of COVID in the weeks ahead, if that's something you want to do. But please identify what sort of themes or issues you want to talk about, or what areas of knowledge sharing and capacity building you'd like to engage with. The second question asks about relationship building. One of the things that we had also promised was that we would, through these webinars, convene smaller groups of community of interest to help people get to know each other in advance of the summit, and to ensure that their perspectives are built into the agenda and the work that we do in the summit. We gave the example of pulling together a webinar for the young worker delegates, or racialized communities or different groups. So please identify if there are any communities of interest that you want to pull together to have a more focused discussion. Please identify those. And if there's anything else that you want to let us know in the survey, there's each of the responses is an open-ended response. So please do fill those out. We will be taking them seriously and looking at them, and we'll be getting back to you once we've had a chance to look at that. I'm going to give you one more plug, which is that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we are having an Equal Pay Day virtual rally. Everyone is welcome to join. Please spread the information through your networks. If you go to the Equal Pay Coalition website, which is equalpaycoalition.org, there's a link to how to register for the virtual rally, and we will be having speakers from across the country on that. And then finally, how to reach us. Please do reach out to us. If there's information you want to share, we're happy to push it through these networks. If you have questions, comments, or you just want to connect, there's our email, summit2020@equalpaycoalition.org. The two organizations that have been organizing this work are the Equal Pay Coalition and CREA, and those are where you can follow us on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram. So again, thank you so much for your participation today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the weeks and months ahead.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.